more about permaculture. One thing for people just to keep in mind is that we have a bunch of books right over there. Those are some of the most poignant resources that we have for those are our go-to books when we want to, when we're thinking about designing or doing permaculture work. So if you guys want to take notes about what we have over there, all of those are very excellent resources.
The proven library.
It's only like $30. It's crazy how much information.
And there's a good balance. Some of the forest gardening books are much more technically oriented and lots of detail, lots of theoretical frameworks and explanatory drawings and things along those lines. And then you have Sepp Holzer, who is this Austrian mountain man who's been doing it since he was a kid, and it's much more full of anecdotes and sort of do what you love, and so yeah, you need it all.
You also have better graphics.
The forest garden books that Dave Jack
Dave Jackie.
Yeah, are filled with tables. That's one of my spots.
Yes,
They have
yes.
just big amounts of data.
There's lots of information, yeah.
Indeed, you did a lot of good work of bringing these together, lots of little resources. I go back to this table. One thing that's different about that forest gardening book is that it's primarily for the East Coast, and it's primarily for a different climate. It's not like the Mediterranean, continental, western climate. And so a lot of what we're doing here, while it harkens upon a lot of the key concepts in his book, the ecology of this area is much different than the ecology of New England. And so it takes a bit of understanding and a bit of observation of your land to realize that the stuff that's capable of what he's talking about and the sort of examples of forest gardens in that book are harder to pull off, at least on this side of the mountains, or basically from the Cascades over to the Rockies. That sort of interior climate is its own sort of thing, however common it is to the west, the western United States. And so there's yet to be a forest gardens anthology thing that is specifically for the western
Pacific Northwest.
Yeah,
I
Pacific
like
Northwest.
Martin Crawford's book because it's slightly closer to our climate, but maybe not here.
Particularly in Portland, the
But we're
coastal
closer to
maritime.
Portland,
Yeah.
so it's closer to the climate.
Yeah, but out here on the east side of the mountain where it's a little drier, absolutely right.
All right, so we're gonna get started here. And this part of the course is about permaculture in general. We're gonna go through some basic principles and try to relate it to what we're doing on the land and try to give you guys some ideas about how to think about designing, how to think about applying sort of the things you learn from nature, or applying ecology, to how you think about your land and your life in general. So permaculture, yeah, can be thought of basically as, well, applied ecology. That's kind of like the physical kind of and procedural kind of things that go into making landscapes that are productive and ecologically sound. And then there's also this ethical component, which is really important to permaculture. It's not just techniques. It's a manner of looking at the world and the resources and the way that we interact with one another and with nature. So that's two important parts of it. So when we talk about applied ecology, what are we talking about? What is it applied to? And most basically, it's applied to meeting our basic needs. And so we can think of what are our needs, right? Because there's needs versus wants. So what I would consider our basic needs being food, energy, like heat when it's cold outside, and, shelter, community, and a local economy. So you can think of that as the economy as it's usually referred to as like trading money and goods with other people, as well as the sort of homestead economy or the economy of the natural world. So you have to kind of be operating within that, the economy of what is available. And you could also think of it as operating within the solar economy. If you're talking about a sustainable world, it's like you have to bring your needs down and scale it to the amount of energy that's actually coming into the system, which is primarily from the sun. So right now with fossil fuels we're able to use a lot more energy per capita than is actually coming in from the sun, because we have all this stored up sunshine.
So when people talk about, to what degree or how much energy decline are we going to be looking at, and what kind of lifestyle will we be needing to live if we're not basing our lives off of fossil fuels, it's really that of how much energy is being captured by our local ecosystem in a calendar year. And so, while I can't necessarily give you numbers for that, and that it's a framework to think about it, like, okay, really what can, and how much can I capture, and also it sort of gives you a poke and a prod to say, gosh, I really need to be capturing as much energy, diffuse energy as possible, and concentrating it into forms that meet these needs.
And so what's in the handout, it goes through like the 12 principles of permaculture, which is sort of outlined by Dave Holmgren, who was one of the first people to come up and coin the word permaculture and start developing the idea. And while we're not going to go through the 12 things, the 12 principles,
we have much of that is founded on the sort of the ecological component that we talked about earlier,
Indeed.
the systems and the cycles and waste.
Mm-hmm. But in order, like generally what we're doing to meet these needs is looking at the flows of energy that are naturally occurring and like making use of them in order to get a yield that either provides these things or supports these things in some way. And also I want to talk about the ethics. And so they're usually referred to as, or what Mollison refers to them as, is care for the earth, which is, we have to take care of the earth. If we're destroying our home, we won't have a home anymore. And then there's care for people. If we're not taking care of one another, if we're not thinking about one another and have that as a basic part of our way of acting, then that creates the sort of scarcity and competition that is rampant in the world today. And then what Bill Mollison, who's like the guy, the big black book over there, the designer's manual, what he writes as the third component of the ethics is setting limits to growth and like resource consumption. Oftentimes this is called fair share, but I think that that's kind of a weird interpretation of what Mollison originally wrote, which was, again, we have to live within our means. We have to live within the solar budget and the ecological budget that we have available to us. So it's not only sharing our surpluses, but it's also just like realistically what he was talking about is like there's too many people in the world for the earth to support it in the ways that we are. So we are just living outside of our means in a variety of different ways. So we have to fundamentally think about what are the capacities of our land and of nature. And we need to put ourselves in check. We need to give rights to all living things and rights to other people and not take more than is our fair share.
Could I recommend a very accessible book
Sure.
on that? It's called Beyond Growth. It's by the economist Herman Bailey. He's considered the father of environmental economics.
Indeed. So what we're talking about in permaculture is both meeting our needs and doing so in a way that is like wholesome and supportive of life and greater diversity, both of culture and like biodiversity. So we want to talk about zone planning. That's sort of the next step in this conversation. Zones are sort of a way to think about how to physically structure the landscape, and it's basically there's zones of use, moving from intense use or how many visits you make to a particular area every year, and moving outward from there with less intensity of use. So it's basically like, how do you design your systems to be efficient of your time and energy? So the things that you need to take care of every single day, well, you should make sure that they're close to where your hub is. And so there are these different zones. So zone 0, I don't know if people talk about zone 0 a lot, but we think of zone 0 as you. So first and foremost, you have to take care of yourself. You have to make sure that you're psychologically and physically in good health and in good working order, because you're always with your body all the time. And so if you're constantly neglecting your body, that's no way to live. It's kind of like the tool, the vehicle that we move through the world in.
So much of permaculture is about efficiently using the resources that we have available to us and making good use of the resources that we have available to us. And our most fundamental resource, as Andrew is saying, is our own self, is our psychological health, our physical health. And so making sure that we tend to that. And it might just be like hearkening on something that everybody's already aware of, but it's critically important to being able to, particularly over time, have success in these permacultural systems, because it's something that persists over time. And so 1 year of hard work isn't really going to guarantee you the system. It's not going to give you a what is culture call this place? The Kramatov?
Kremaderhof?
You're not gonna
I don't know what that means, but
you're not gonna have that level of success in your system if you sort of have a faulty or inconsistent level of application of these ideas. And so tending to yourself is really the best way that you can ensure continuity.
And can I comment?
Sure.
I just think that that's a really important point, because I feel like in a way permaculture is a movement, and so often in other movements you see that people don't take care of themselves and they easily burn out, and then the movement goes nowhere, or it becomes more stagnant. And so and I found that a lot with activists that I've worked with, and so I'm really
Prevent burnout.
yeah.
Grateful about this.
right. So if you're operating from a baseline level of unsustainable psychological and physical like exertion, that you're just gonna crash, and then the whole thing is going to not really work.
Well, the other idea is that you hit on earlier, that everything's connected. Now because of that, if my resources are reduced, that's less for you also. You know, because we're in community, so it's very important for me to take care of myself,
Right.
for your sake.
Yeah, and that's particularly poignant in like Windward's case, where if like someone gets sick, or if we all get sick at one time, that's really not so great. But because like we each kind of are taking care of ourselves, if we do like if something kind of catastrophic happens, that we can cover for one another and make sure that the whole thing continues to move on. So that kind of hits upon like community. It's a very important piece of sustainability, but that's for later. That's for this evening conversation. Yeah, so moving to the zone 1, that's like your house. It's your main habitation. So on a homestead, it probably would be like a house, a single building where you occupy most of the time. Or it could be like a couple of buildings where you have like your little office area, you have your place where you sleep, you have maybe an outdoor kitchen, etc. Sort of the nucleus of your life.
But it's not just the house, it's also the places that are closest in, like your herb garden, things that you want to frequent every day or a couple of days, several times a day.
Right, so it's the most like intensively managed area, or the stuff that needs the most intensive management should be right there because you're going to see it all the time. And it's the stuff that you need access to every day. So if you're cooking, you want your herb garden, your kitchen garden, your greens that you want to harvest regularly, your strawberries that are going to be more productive if you continue to harvest them when they're in season, things like that, thinking about what will do best if it's harvested regularly.
Like if
And
you have
so-
dairy goats, for example, and that's something that often is milked once a day or even twice a day, depending on your management technique. So that's something you want relatively close in. Same thing with your
Laying
chickens.
hens, yeah.
You're going to go get your eggs every day. You don't want to have to walk a half a mile, or even a quarter of a mile if it's just across your backyard. But
Indeed. So thinking about how to get those things that you use every day as close in as possible when you're designing your system. And zone 2 is still a really intensively managed landscape. Oftentimes this can be like annual gardens where maybe you visit it several times a week and you harvest from it regularly, but maybe doesn't need daily care, or it could still potentially need daily care. You can also have other animals or livestock in this area. Generally, if you're talking about zones and you think about like concentric circles, the further you get out, the larger the piece of landscape is, right? The nucleus is like rather small, and your zone 1 can be significantly larger just in area. And so that's another way to think about how these zones sort of work. Do you want to draw the zone map thing? While it's often talked about zones being concentric circles, it doesn't have to be circular, or you don't really impose the circle onto the landscape. So you can think about it in this way, where you can still have your zone 3 near your house. Your zone 3 area. Sure, why not? So another thing that could be in zone 2 is like your storage of food. So like your root cellars, your wood stores, maybe tool sheds and things that you'll want access to. Perhaps like where you park your car, etc. So moving outward from there, we have zone 3, which is large-scale crops. So if you were really being self-sufficient and you wanted to grow some grain, or you wanted to have pasture for your animals, because it takes up a significant amount of space, it would be needing to be a little bit further out. Let's see what else can go in there. If you had a low-intensity food forest where you only had to visit it a little bit, or you're only harvesting it from it like once, or you have crops where you harvest like once a year, like apples, mushrooms, things like that. That's all kind of a zone 3 area. And continuing to move outward, zone 4 is sort of semi-wild, moving into more of just like whatever the natural ecology happens to be in your area. And that can be timber, forage. You can think of the campground here as sort of our zone 4. We do have sheep and pigs that range back here, but as you can tell, there's not a whole lot of infrastructure development. It's pretty much just the native forest. It's very sort of lightly managed. We're capturing that energy by using animals and stuff to harvest the grass and the acorns and things like that. And we also, when we have a dead tree, we will cut it down and use it for firewood or use it for lumber. So moving out from zone 4 is pretty much just the wild, whatever happens to be outside of there. If you're like us, it really is like rather wild, where you just have like no one occupying that space, but it could be your neighbor's property. And if you have a large enough acreage, you can have you're capable of having a zone 5 where you just have like whatever natively would be there. You can also try to incorporate like a little native patch on your 1 acre or 5 acre parcel as well, just to provide some sort of corridor for wildlife to exist in, so that you have kind of a smaller impression on the native landscape. Or you can at least keep like kind of a seed bank going, a living seed bank of the native ecology.
There is two things. There is a benefit to having this, sort of 4 and 5 not necessarily be super far away in terms of that they're, products, so to speak, that come out of these can be spiritual in nature and recreational in nature, which sort of harken back to this zone 0. And so sometimes it's nice to be able to easily get away from the sounds of the chickens and just hear, the wind in the treetops. And so to be able to have easy access from the area closest to home into to be able to have a circuit or to be able to walk through or to be able to have a meditation garden or things along those lines. And then also Windward, because we are more of a village stead as opposed to a single homestead, that there's multiple zone 1s. And so that does create a bit of a complexing factor when if any of you are thinking about or working with multiple homes as opposed to just a single one homestead.
So yeah, we have all these zone 1s, and then we sort of have this is sort of like all of our zone 2 area, because it's where we live, it's where we occupy. We have our gardens. In here we have animals up on the sides of the hill. And then moving outward, generally our property goes this way. So we have our zone 4 and our zone 3 sort of just around the outskirts. We also, because we're doing village scale stuff, we have workshops and energy infrastructure that's probably much larger than a homestead. So we have I don't entirely know where to put it, but we have this whole workshop area right down below, and it also is a lot of storage space, a lot of tools and workshops, so that's something to think about as well. Perhaps that's more of a zone 2 or zone 3 area for you if you are doing a lot of construction or a lot of maintenance or alternative energy stuff.
Physically, is that adjacent to where we are right now?
Yes.
It's that way.
You guys drove past it when you drove up. You would have had to turn off to the right, but
Yeah.
it's all right.
So yeah, we have a pasture system right
We're
there,
here.
and that goes downhill. And once you get to the bottom of that hill, you have our main gardens and trees. So
Yeah, just we're more or less right here right now in comparison to so much of what Andrew's referencing is over this way.
It's nice to have a tour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be able to see it more tomorrow as we go up to the hugelkultur bed, because the hugelkultur bed, interestingly, the area that we are working in and developing that area is back here, and I guess it's what Andrew was drawing here. And so it's one area that was more 3-4, but in proximity it's really 2. And we are going to be because we're modifying how we're using that space, it's something that is changing from something that's more of a zone 3 or 4 into a zone that's going to be more of a 2. And so that's something else to keep in mind, is that with time, your zones are going to be shifting. And you're going to start likely closest to your home, and then as you got that figured out, you're going to extend out. And so yeah.
right. And so zones are a way to think about how you physically structure the environment and sort of design and plan for that. And then there's also sectors, which is something that Bill Mollison and David Holmgren talked about quite a lot in their writing. Sectors are sort of looking at the existing or natural dynamics that are on the landscape. So that can be a lot of different stuff. Oftentimes it's focused around energy flows. So if you have a stream, or you have where are your prevailing winds coming from in different seasons? What is the path of the sun through the sky at different times of year? There's sort of aspect, how the slopes interact with the path of the sun, and the the topography, where you have hills and valleys. That impacts, where you have sun traps and microclimates. Perhaps you want to hold water in ponds or in water storage tanks as high up on the property as you can, so that you can gravity doing the work of feeding your lines. That's how Windward is set up. There's also not just energy and landscape features, but also like wildlife. Where are the wildlife corridors? Like I know that we have coyotes that come in on the northern end of our property and on the southern end of our property, but because of our main habitation area, they just kind of go around us. So understanding that, and we may be able to see that when we go walk around the property, actually you can see where the wildlife travel because they more or less travel in the same area all the time. There's also roads and infrastructure. So where are the power lines, where are the roads, where are your water systems located? So if you're wanting to do like an intensive garden, doing it someplace where there's no water infrastructure, probably not the greatest idea because you may need to supply it with supplemental water. So that's all things to keep in mind. There's also things like where your neighbor's at, where are sources of sound coming from that could be disturbing, like if you have a road or your neighbor likes to play loud music or something. There's also more psychological aspects of the landscape, like what areas make you feel peaceful, like what Lindsay was talking about, the zone 5 areas. Like maybe you don't want to take a peaceful area and be like, tear it down and try to do a food forest there because it naturally has this feel that is really nourishing to you. And there's also things like a good view. Perhaps like on a piece of your property you can see out to a nice landscape or something like that. So you want to keep that in mind as well when planning for it.
So I'm just going to add,
Yeah.
so much of what this is about is are mechanisms and frameworks for how to think about your land. And that's to take note of certain, what is the existing or natural dynamics on your property, and to either maximize them, whether if that is an energy flow or a water source, you want to be able to plan your property development in such a way that you're maximizing the use of that water source, for example. Or to minimize it. Like if you know that the prevailing wind's coming from a certain direction, then maybe you want to plant a windbreak there. Or maybe you don't want to put your house like right where the most forceful winds come. So it's just a way to facilitate your planning and to think about your property. So these are, it's sort of abstract sectors, is sort of odd, and the way he talks about it in these books can be a bit confusing, but
Yeah, they're Australian, so they use words differently. So they talk about sectors, and oftentimes they'll have like the thing split up into sort of like a north-south, east-west axis, and you have the sun coming in a certain sectors, and you have wind coming from certain sectors, and wildlife coming from other sectors. But it doesn't have to necessarily be thought about in such a rigid way. You're just kind of basically trying to account for all the sort of dynamics that are going on in your property and either minimizing or maximizing their benefits or uses. You know, you may not want your prevailing winds to be sweeping over your garden, but you can still like position your wind energy infrastructure right there to make sure that you're capturing that energy. So, yeah. Another big part of permaculture is, in terms of the applied ecology aspect of this, a lot of like what Mollison has written and what people designing permaculture systems, what are they basing everything off of? They're basing it off of nature and how natural dynamics just happen. So what are the elements in natural ecosystems? What are the processes going on? How do the cycles function? How does nature, how has it adapted to certain environments? And so more than anything, looking at the natural ecology of where you're doing permaculture can tell you more about how you should design your landscape than perhaps anything else. So I want to go through a couple of different like patterns that are found in nature, patterns and processes. The first one is layers. So layers of like a forest. So you'll have kind of a structurally diverse landscape where you have stuff growing at different levels and stuff occupying different zones of the soil in terms of how the roots are structured. And so in a monocultural situation, you'll just like have one layer and it'll be like wheat, and everything is the same height and land is needing the exact same nutrients, and they're all in direct competition with one another. And so that's like, that's just a one layered system, and that's really unnatural, doesn't really hardly ever exist. Even in a pasture situation, you have stuff that's taller and stuff that's shorter, there's like variation. And it's a polyculture situation.